Have you ever heard of a desire path? Now, even if this terminology is new to you, I guarantee you've experienced the phenomenon in which there will be a specific path through, let's say, a park or something, brick lay, asphalt, concrete, whatever. They'll be going through a specific area, and then there will be a hard beaten area to the side of it, or that splits away from that path towards, I don't know, something of interest, maybe towards a bench, or cutting across a grass area to another path, or to a bus stop, or just any other thing. And it's not an intended route from whoever designed the layout of the park or whatever. It's just something that has become a common shortcut, often cross an otherwise unintended route. And sometimes it's ironic of that it'll literally just be parallel to an intended path. It'll be a pathway with an area of hard packed dirt that is exposed to soil underneath grass, in which people have just walked alongside the pathway, and or have ridden a bicycle or ridden a horse along there instead. And there's a whole host of reasons why people do this. Sometimes it literally is just to save time. Instead of going out and around, they will go straight across. Sometimes it's due to accessibility concerns, of that there will be a brick lay path that's not easy for people with diminished visibility, or the ability to see, or they rely on a wheelchair or some other form of rolling locomotion that is uncomfortable to travel along flagstone or along brick lay paths that way. Or it'll be that there's an area with a lot of potholing and people will go around it instead of going through it. And it's something of or if you've ever lived on a corner lot of a neighborhood, corner lot, it's pretty common that wherever the furthest corner of your lot happens to be, the end of your yard, people will just clip that little tiny bit of grass from one street to the other to save the, I don't know, 10 milliseconds that it allows them to save for some reason. I don't know what they plan to do with that amount of time that they just saved, but it's a pretty common thing. And you can sod that path all you want. You can put seed down, you can do whatever you want, but it will never really successfully grow because people keep tramping it down. Or like where my house happens to be the second lot in, and the first lot is uninhabited, and so people will cut across that thing completely, and so there is a really deep mud trail that goes right across it whenever there's any kind of rain or something, because even though the inclement weather would obviously make the grass in the middle of it soggy, people are still caught off guard by this. And anyway, it's this basically, it's driven civil engineers and landscapers crazy for as long as this phenomenon has been observed, because of the question of what to do about it. Do you put an obstruction, like let's say a garbage can or something, in that specific path to keep people from being able to make that straight cut? Because quite frankly, people will actually go out of their way to continue to use that path even if there is an obstruction. Do you just simply use the path, maybe reestablish it in a little bit more secure way, put some bricks down or pour some concrete or something, and just, if this is the way people want to go, we'll just go that way from now on. Just appropriate it in that way, kind of endorse it, condone it? Or do you actively try to subvert it, make it more uncomfortable to travel that way? Or you put in a thorn and thistle bushes across it in order to make it even more uncomfortable? Like, what do you do? And there's many different approaches to it as there are opportunities to observe it. And the reason I'm bringing all of this up is that our minds are very similar. There are neuronal paths in our brains of how we think and prefer to think and have been taught to think. And what these end up doing is you have interpretive matrices, lenses, hermeneutics for how you approach the world, some of which you're aware of, some of which that you are not. And so there's these things called heuristics in a psychological sense, and it's basically like thought shorthand. It's shortcuts that your brain takes from point A to point B to save itself energy, because your brain is really, really, I guess I'll just say efficiency supposedly is really important to your brain. And so it'll take every imaginable shortcut that it can try to do in order to save itself energy for something in the future. And sometimes that means, kind of metaphorically, cutting that little tiny corner off of a lawn of thought to save yourself even that couple of grams of glucose energy in the end. Like, we don't necessarily know what we'll do with it, but we just want to hold on to it just in case, I guess. And as a result, we end up structuring these things called prolegomenons. It's essentially the thinking you do before you think about something. It's the intentional presuppositions that your mind formulates before it is exposed to new information. I've just been having a conversation with somebody recently when we were talking about the Trinity. He's a Unitarian, I'm a Trinitarian, and how we're disagreeing about the way to interpret certain passages in the Bible. And really it came down to, well, we have to look at the context. Context is king. And his response to that was to try and associate his hermeneutic of Unitarianism as the context to dictate the passage. My response to that is that his hermeneutic had become a heuristic, a shortcut into a prolegomenon. And what that means is that essentially it was like lenses, if you need glasses to see, right? That changes the way you see the world so that you cannot see the world in a different way without them. And that if you aren't wearing them, you can't see hardly at all. If you put them on, you can't see the world in any other way. This is a dangerous thing, and it is one of the biggest pitfalls most religious people happen to have, especially, I'd say, the more fundamentalist Christians. If you think about, there's liberal Christians that are just kind of go with the flow, and then there are fundamentalist Christians that are obstructions. And using the metaphor that I've kind of been sewing together here of how to respond to the desire paths, there are those that try to institute obstructions to try and prevent people from using those paths. And then there are certain people that try to kind of deputize those paths. And so, like, the liberal side would see that the culture is leaning positively in the direction of same-sex and other forms of sexual deviance as being institutionalized and being politically endorsed and so forth like that. And so they're leaning in that direction. The United Methodists and the Episcopals and the ELCA, whatever, are leaning that way of just being totally adoptionistic towards those ideas and enshrining them in their doctrinal statements and so forth. They're laying brick into those heuristical paths, those desire paths people have in this culture. And then there's over here of that they go and they hold the signs with language on them that would get this video taken down, right? Outside of college campuses, outside of different institutions, and fling accusations and vitriolic language and so like those are the ones that they're putting in those obstacles, especially the really thorny, the really like they're putting in wrought iron fences and thorn bushes and anything to keep people from trying to. But as I established, of people are going to anyway. In fact, in cities like Portland and Seattle, Washington, and in San Francisco, when people erect what is referred to sometimes as hostile architecture in order to prevent people from using these paths, they will actually bring tools, like bolt cutters or things of that nature in order to dismantle those obstructions, sometimes making a really big statement about it. But for the most part, it'll be done like at night under the cover of darkness. They will cut a hole through the fence, or if there's a trash can there, they will move the trash can, or they will unbolt a park bench from the ground and move it out of the way in order to increase or reliberate traffic headed through this intended path, this kind of thing. So there's this conflict that's happening in that zone. And of course, over here in the heuristic path of that, people are saying that of like scripture clearly forbids these things, and just that conversation's happening over there. And in here in the middle, we're having this kind of, we know both of those movements, both of those extremes are wrong. What should we do? And of course, from the outside of the world, if you are in the middle trying to navigate this thing, you are just pushed perceptively. You're pushed to one of those extremes, whether you want to or not. A couple years ago, during one of the leadership meetings, because my wife is on staff at our church, leadership meeting, they were talking about what to do with the Pride Parade. Do you go as a church? Do you try to have a presence there, build familiarity and things? And I've done that before. And so from my experience was the hardest thing about doing something like that is not getting the permit, setting up the table, putting out documentation and published materials or anything like it. None of those things are very difficult. The hardest thing about that is not being mislabeled as one of those two extremes, as the hate groups or the affirmative groups, and not being mislabeled in one of those two directions. It's very difficult, because if I'm just trying to be a good citizen, you get pushed off in that direction of that you're just being affirmative and endorsing people's sins and stuff like that. But if I'm trying to be doctrinally pure and say that no, hold the line, these are sin, but we are willing to receive a sinful person into our congregation and help them navigate that path, then we are pushed in this other direction of being hateful and derogatory. And so like, it's very difficult. What do we do? I'd say on the one hand, one thing I mentioned about these desire paths is the reason people use them is different in each case. Sometimes it's an accessibility issue. Sometimes it's a shortcut issue of that. Sometimes when you see these parks that civil engineers put together, they'll put these really interesting artistic sweeping paths through it that may be aesthetically pleasing, but they are incredibly inefficient from getting from one point to another. And so people will just cut across those curves. So maybe sometimes having an alternative path that does shortcut some of those wily routes is valid. And sometimes having a route that is smoother to traverse for someone that is more sensitive to bumps is valid. And sometimes, no, people do actually need to be redirected out of that desire path and back onto the road. This is something that occurs in national heritage sites and national parks and things of that nature, that desire paths usually go to dangerous places and that they need to be corrected, not enabled. And so there'll be signage of do not step off the path because you will damage the local ecosystem. You will harm the plants that are in more delicate states, things of that nature, that no, you do need to stay on the path even if you don't want to. And so it is case by case in some ways. There is no blanket answer. The way I would answer this question with the metaphor of theologically might change not only on the basis of issue at hand, but individual at hand. Certain people are more receptive to dialogue and correction than others, in part because people are not aggregate collections of arguments and logic. They're not. It's something that came up for a separate reason with another dialogues that I was having, that people are not aggregate collections of arguments that if you just present counter arguments, it's going to flip those things over. It's not like that. For the most part, most people are emotional first and logical second. What this means is that over time you interact with people in different circumstances, and that those interactions formulate heuristics about categories of people. For instance, Christians. And those emotional stamp points need to be addressed first. Those traumas, those wounds, those misunderstandings need to be addressed first and lanced sometimes if it's like an infected wound. Like you got to lance and drain and treat before you can move on to the next thing. And that those attention to the individual, listening ears open, are what often will allow you to begin to address what this desire path in their mind happens to be, and why it happens to be there, and whether or not it should be reestablished, discouraged, or some other third option. So I hope all of that makes sense. Probably not.